Let's get right to friend of the show, Howard Fineman, editorial director of the Huffington Post Media Group. Howard, always great to see you.
Hi, Abby.
So, you know, crisis after crisis, whether it be Iran or Syria, the United States continues to emerge as anything but confident and powerful. And the situation in Ukraine seems to be following in the same path. And the Wall Street Journal has a pretty brutal piece out today asking a question that I think is on many people's minds. They say, we know Mr. Obama didn't run for president to engage in great power politics, but it is still part of the job description. Is he still interested in doing his job? And who better to answer that than you, Howard? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the president is very much interested in doing his job. I think people around him, including some very senior people that I talked to, admit that Syria was a mess diplomatically. The president drew a line in the sand, the famous red line about chemical weapons in Syria, and then didn't follow through in terms of tough military action that he seemed to be threatening. And he had the further humiliation of being pulled out of the jam by Vladimir Putin himself. The danger there is that I think it gave Putin the idea that the president could be pushed around. The difficulty here is that the president has no really good options. I think he's very engaged. He's very much on the job on this, but he's got difficulties that make it hard for him to move in a forceful way. As you say, military is out. We don't have the Navy in the Black Sea. We don't have the troops on the ground. We can't contemplate massive military aid to the Ukraine. Meanwhile, Europe is divided. The countries close to the old Soviet Union, Lithuania and Poland, which are very nationalistic. I've been in both places. They're very nationalistic. They fear the Russians deeply. They're the ones who want to move militarily and with strong economic sanctions, but Western Europe isn't sure, and Germany is in the middle, and the last thing Germany wants to do is take a warlike stance with Russia.
Yeah, Howard, build on that point, would you? Because how much of this is really about Obama as a leader who's trying to do certain things, and how much of it is about larger geopolitical an exhaustion in this country? I think a bipartisan exhaustion with too much military entanglement, a shifting role of NATO. I think Kissinger was right that we are lucky the Ukraine is not part of NATO, because neither NATO nor the U.S. wants to have any collective automatic response here. How much of this is a larger historical shift?
I think very much so. And as I say, the people around him admit that Syria was a mess. But this thing isn't Barack Obama's fault. I talked about the EU and the divisions there. That's one factor for sure. The fact that the United States in the last 10 years or so or more has spent several $1 trillion and exhausted a lot of public patience with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan has a lot to do with it also. And it's a complicated situation in Ukraine. Unlike Poland, unlike Lithuania, Ukraine it's kind of like a Cain and Abel biblical brother situation with Russia and the Ukraine. It's difficult to untangle. There are some legitimate concerns of Russian speakers in some parts of the Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin is going to take advantage of every single one of them that he can. He's played a long, deep game, and he's waited for the West, including the United States and Europe, to kind of exhaust itself with military great power adventures in places like the Persian Gulf. And he's moving at a time when history favors somebody who's as brazen as he is in this part of the world.
Howard, you talk about no good options. You talk about picking the right historical moment. Well, part of that is the economic situation in Europe and in America. The folks who are screaming for more sanctions and harsher sanctions are not really dealing with the idea that the globe is interconnected, especially economically. If we were to work with Europe to have harsher sanctions on Russia, say buy less of their oil or no of their oil, that would hurt Russia, but it would also hurt Europe at a time when Europe is still recovering, and that would hurt the American economy. And I'm not sure if folks really think that is worth it for America.
Well, it's a fine line, and the president is carefully searching for what else he can do by way of economic pressure without sending Europe into another recession. And I do think that in terms of energy use, because that's the main thing here. It's not the only thing, but the most immediate thing that the Russians can do to create havoc in Europe is, of course, to cut off natural gas supplies. That would hurt them as well. But there are things we can do in terms of energy conservation, in terms of new types of energy, and indeed in terms of hydrocarbons and carbon-based fuels here that can take the pressure off Europe. And we ought to get at it because it's important. It's important if we want to use economic pressure as opposed to the military pressure we can't apply to get Putin to behave. And I think what the Ukrainians are doing now is that they're taking military action because they realize that they've got to raise the cost to Putin of an invasion. That's what's really going on here. They feel, I think the Ukrainians feel, that they're going to get invaded one way or the other, probably, and they better show Putin that if Europe isn't going to do anything and the United States isn't going to do anything, that the Ukrainians are willing to fight and die for their country.
Well, and
that's
Howard,
what's happening.
You mentioned energy. There are some who are making the case that if we approve the Keystone XL pipeline, that will solve this crisis. Let's hear General James Jones, former National Security Advisor to President Obama, make that case.
The international bullies who wish to use energy scarcity as a weapon against us all are watching intently. So if we want to make Mr. Putin's day and strengthen his hand, we should reject Keystone. If we want to gain an important measure of national energy security, jobs, tax revenue, and prosperity to advance our work on the spectrum of energy that don't rely on carbon, then it should be approved.
Does this make sense to you, Howard?
I'm not sure Keystone Pipeline is the most efficient and shrewdest energy answer that there is. So I'm not willing to go along with General Jones necessarily.
Yeah, that's a much deeper conversation. Howard Fineman, great analysis as always. Thanks for joining us.